The air in Babylon was heavy, thick with heat and incense. Behind the golden doors of the palace, the greatest conqueror of the known world lay motionless on his bed. Alexander's chest rose only slightly, his lips trembling as if whispering to someone no one else could see. The soldiers waiting outside the chamber were silent, too afraid to speak. They said the son of Zeus could not die, yet the smell of oil and sweat was already stronger than the scent of myrrh. He had once crossed deserts where men and horses turned to dust. He had crushed empires and claimed to be more than human. Now, his skin turned pale, his voice a faint echo swallowed by the noise of flies. His generals knelt beside him, each one thinking not of grief, but of the power that would soon be without a master. The torches flickered, and for the first time, Alexander's eyes seemed to recognize what he could never conquer: the slow decay of flesh. A scribe recorded that he tried to speak, to name his successor, but his tongue refused to move. The same mouth that had commanded thousands could no longer form a single word. Outside, Babylon's heat pressed against the marble walls, turning the air into something that could not be breathed. When the final breath left him, there was no thunder, no divine light, only the sound of a drop of oil falling from the lamp beside his bed. Yet when the priests came to anoint his body, they found it unchanged, still warm, the skin glowing as if lit from within. Days passed, but the scent of decay never came. They said it was a sign of divinity. Others whispered it was something far worse. If you believe that even gods can rot, stay until the end. And if you seek the untold truths buried beneath crowns and corpses, subscribe to our channel, where history bleeds and silence remembers. The sun fell like a blade over the city, melting dust into sweat. In the streets, priests poured wine upon the stones, begging the gods to show mercy to the king who had conquered them all. Inside the palace, silence had become another form of fear. The days before his death were a slow disintegration, a desert without horizon. Alexander, the man who had crossed the Indus and burned Persepolis, began speaking to voices no one else could hear. He said he saw armies marching on the walls, seas that breathed, and shadows calling his name. On his last conscious night, he asked for wine. His generals obeyed. The cup was filled 3 times, and 3 times he emptied it. He stood, trembling, and said that his body was burning, that every nerve was a torch. Then, without strength, he collapsed onto his bed. From that moment, the heat never left his skin. Babylon boiled under a windless sky, and within the royal chamber the air thickened with the sharp scent of metal and dying flowers. The physicians ordered baths of oil and ointments of lotus, but the fever kept rising, slow and cruel, as if the sun itself had hidden inside him. For 6 days, men waited for him to wake. His breathing became a thread so faint it could barely move the air. No one dared to declare him dead. Custom demanded that the king pass his ring to his successor, but his hand no longer obeyed. Some said he was sleeping. Others that his sickness was punishment from the gods for calling himself the son of Zeus. Outside, the soldiers prayed as the army began to crumble without command. Every whisper of his agony spread through the corridors like poison. On the hottest nights, servants swore they heard his voice, a brief murmur from the bed, speaking the names of battles and faraway cities. The physicians whispered among themselves, afraid that his illness was contagious. No one approached without covering their face with wine-soaked cloth. The fever, they said, was not ordinary. It came from beyond the desert, an invisible flame that burned only those who had touched glory. On the 6th day, his pulse stopped, but his body remained warm. No one dared close his eyes. His mother was thousands of miles away, his armies scattered, his empire frozen in disbelief. The scribes wrote the date, but no one knew the exact hour. Some said that as night fell, a black bird landed on the palace roof and never flew again. Others swore that the Nile, far away, paused for a single breath. When dawn came, the city fell silent. The statue of the god Marduk was veiled in black, and the sound of hammers building his tomb echoed through the palace like mourning. On the walls, soldiers carved a single phrase: "The king sleeps, but the fire does not die." It was the beginning of something no one dared to name, a death too slow to be human, too perfect to be divine. The palace of Babylon became a tomb before the tomb was built. Days passed, and the heat did not claim what it was owed. The priests waited for the scent of death to rise, for the body to change, for the skin to darken and stiffen. But the corpse of Alexander remained soft and strangely radiant, as if it had learned how to breathe without air. The embalmers whispered that the gods had not taken him yet, that his soul was trapped between kingdoms. Others feared something worse, that the king had conquered death and now lingered as a spirit too proud to leave his own flesh. Word spread beyond the palace walls. People came from the markets, from the camps outside the city, to see the miracle. They were told to stay away. But the rumor could not be contained. Some knelt and prayed to the body as if it were an idol, believing the conqueror had become a god. Others crossed themselves and fled, saying that the earth had begun to punish him for his arrogance. For the first time, even his generals looked at his face with unease. The features were calm, untouched by decay. His eyelids had not sunk. His lips still held a faint color. It was as though he were sleeping in the heat of an unending day. The embalmers prepared to open the body. They brought alabaster jars, sharp bronze knives, and linen soaked in myrrh. But when they approached, the air thickened. The chief priest refused to cut, saying that to pierce flesh so pure was to offend the divine. Others said the heart still held warmth. One man, trembling, touched the skin and swore it was neither cold nor stiff. The soldiers guarding the door stepped back, crossing their arms against their chests, unsure if they were watching a resurrection or a curse. As the days turned into a week, Babylon began to rot instead. Food spoiled faster, the water stank, and the animals grew restless. It was as if the city itself was paying for the body's refusal to decay. Each morning, flies gathered around the chamber, but none dared to land upon the corpse. The embalmers, desperate, began the rites without cutting, pouring oils and sealing the body in layers of linen and resin. Still, the skin shone beneath the cloth, pale and smooth like polished marble. Whispers grew louder. Some claimed he was not dead at all. His pulse might have slowed until invisible, his breath too shallow to see. A sickness unknown to the world, they said, could paralyze every muscle yet leave the mind awake. It was a thought so terrifying that even the priests stopped praying. To imagine the great king lying silent inside his own coffin, hearing the chants and the scraping of the knives, was too cruel for even the gods to witness. On the 10th day, the generals gathered to decide. They would seal the body and send it home to Macedonia, yet no one could agree where home was. He had lived everywhere and belonged nowhere. The priests begged for more time. The soldiers begged for release. In the center of it all, the body remained, perfect and motionless, the last command of a man who had once ruled the world. When the torches dimmed, a strange calm filled the chamber. The wax on the candles melted in silence, and the faint glow touched the golden mask placed upon his face. What once had been a man now looked like a statue carved by death itself. Outside, thunder rolled without rain, and the people said the gods were arguing over who would claim him. It was no longer a body. It was a prophecy made of flesh. When the fever was gone and silence took his chamber, a new kind of battle began. It was not fought with swords, but with maps, voices, and ambition. The empire had no heir, only generals who once knelt at his feet and now sharpened their smiles instead of their blades. The body of Alexander, untouched by decay, became more than a symbol. It was power itself. Whoever possessed it could claim the blessing of the divine and the loyalty of the soldiers still lost in mourning. Perdiccas, the commander of the royal cavalry, declared that the body must remain in Babylon, the center of the world Alexander had built. He wanted the tomb to become the heart of a new empire, ruled in the name of a dead god. But Ptolemy, shrewd and silent, had other plans. He dreamed of Egypt, of deserts and eternal stone, where the Nile would cradle the corpse and make it immortal. To him, the body was a key that could open kingdoms. The debate turned to whispers, then to threats. Messengers carried orders that contradicted one another. Armies began to move while the city still smelled of incense and sweat. In the palace, servants cleaned the chamber that had once held the living king, and no one dared to look at the golden sarcophagus waiting in the corner. It was said to weigh more than 10 men, cast from pure gold, its lid shaped to match the face of a man who still seemed alive. Perdiccas ordered a grand funeral procession. The route would take the body from Babylon to Macedonia, a journey of thousands of miles. But as the craftsmen built the chariot, covered in gems and ivory, Ptolemy gathered his soldiers in the south. He would not let the body leave his reach. To hold it was to hold the memory of conquest, the illusion of legitimacy. Even death, it seemed, could be conquered if one owned the corpse of a god. When the procession began, the streets of Babylon filled with weeping. The chariot moved slowly, drawn by 64 mules draped in purple cloth. Gold reflected the desert light like fire. People threw flowers and burned incense, their voices rising in mourning and awe. But far ahead, in the silent dunes, Ptolemy waited. The ambush was swift. Under the cover of night, his men surrounded the caravan. The guards did not resist long. They laid down their weapons rather than fight us over what they still believed was sacred. The body of Alexander was taken, wrapped in new linen, sealed again inside the sarcophagus. The caravan turned south toward Egypt, carrying with it both a corpse and the last heartbeat of the empire. When the news reached Babylon, Perdiccas raged. He called it theft, blasphemy, treason, but his fury came too late. The people whispered that Alexander himself had chosen his resting place, that even in death he had turned his face toward the sun. The army began to divide, each man pledging loyalty not to the living, but to whoever held the remains of their king. As the stolen chariot entered the deserts of Sinai, the wheels sank into soft sand. The horses strained under the weight. The wind blew against the golden armor of the coffin, making it ring like a bell. The men swore they could hear a heartbeat echoing through the metal. Some crossed themselves, others fell to their knees. By the time they reached the Nile, the empire had already fractured. Alexander had conquered the world, but his corpse had conquered the men who followed him. The war for his body had become the war for his ghost. The stolen chariot reached Egypt under a sky the color of ash. The soldiers were exhausted, the mules half dead, but the body remained untouched. Ptolemy rode at the front, his armor dulled by sand, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the desert met the river. He had taken what no man should ever own. Behind him, the golden sarcophagus glimmered faintly through the dust, catching every ray of light as if the sun itself refused to abandon it. In Memphis, the priests of the old gods received the corpse with trembling hands. They burned incense until the air grew heavy and golden, singing hymns in languages older than Alexander's empire. Ptolemy ordered a temple to be built around the body, a chamber of limestone carved with scenes of eternal victory. He said the conqueror of worlds would rest where life itself was born, by the Nile that carried both death and resurrection. For months, the work continued. Thousands of workers dragged stone across the plains, their songs echoing through the heat. The sarcophagus was lowered into a crystal coffin, sealed beneath sheets of transparent glass. Oil lamps burned day and night, their flames never allowed to die. When the tomb was finished, the walls shimmered with gold and lapis, and the air smelled of cedar and myrrh. Inside, the figure of Alexander lay as if asleep, a faint smile carved by eternity. Ptolemy visited the chamber alone. He stood before the coffin, his reflection trembling on the glass. Some say he whispered apologies. Others claim he prayed for forgiveness, knowing that he had stolen not only a body, but a destiny. Yet he could not resist touching the golden frame, as if hoping that some fragment of divinity might pass through his hands. Outside, the wind shifted, and for a moment the desert seemed to breathe. Years passed, and Egypt changed rulers, but the tomb remained untouched. When Alexandria rose upon the coast, the body was moved again, carried through streets lined with marble columns and perfumed gardens. The people wept as they watched the procession. To them, it was not a funeral, but a coronation in reverse, the crowning of a god beneath the earth. The new city became a beacon of knowledge and faith, and at its heart slept the man who had triumphed to join heaven and soil. Travelers from every corner of the world came to see him. Romans, Persians, Indians, all stood before the glass coffin and bowed. Julius Caesar laid a wreath of laurel. Augustus touched the face and left in silence. None could deny the strange peace that filled the room. The air was cool and luminous, as if the body still commanded the elements. The priests said the king had not died, but crossed into the realm of light, his soul moving like the sun across eternity. Outside, Alexandria grew louder, brighter, more restless. Ships filled the harbor, scholars filled the libraries, lovers filled the gardens. Yet deep beneath the city, in the quiet of the tomb, there was only stillness. No decay, no time, no noise. The body remained perfect, and the legend fed upon itself. When night fell, the guards at the entrance often heard faint sounds from below. Some said it was the whisper of sand shifting through cracks in the stone. Others believed it was breathing. Whatever it was, they kept their distance, for even in death, Alexander ruled through fear and wonder. The Nile carried on, golden under the moonlight. and the tomb of the sun became a mirror of his empire, brilliant, silent, and forever alive in its illusion. Centuries passed, and the sands swallowed kingdoms that once trembled at his name. Yet the tomb endured, glowing like a secret vein of gold beneath the restless streets of Alexandria. Pilgrims still came, their footsteps echoing through the marble corridors, seeking to look upon the man who had refused to decay. But glory is never content to sleep, and time, the patient conqueror, began to reach for what even death had failed to claim. The priests who once tended the eternal flame grew old and vanished. The songs faded into silence. The temple doors remained closed for generations, guarded by men who no longer remembered the reason. Then came earthquakes, riots, the hunger of empire after empire. The city above changed hands like a coin, passing from the Ptolemies to the Romans, from the Romans to the Byzantines, each believing the tomb was still theirs. Yet with each hand that touched it, the memory blurred. When Julius Caesar had once stood before the glass coffin, the air had glowed. When later emperors arrived, the light seemed dimmer. By the time Caligula sent his men to steal the armor that rested upon the corpse, the chamber was already sinking into shadow. The armor was taken, the glass cracked, and no punishment came. That was when people began to whisper that the gods had turned their faces away. The scholars of Alexandria wrote of the tomb as if it were both legend and warning. They said the body had begun to lose its color, that the scent of myrrh had turned sharp, that the eyes beneath the mask were no longer peaceful. Some claimed the priests had sealed the entrance, others that the sea had swallowed the lower vaults. And still the city grew heavier above it, layer upon layer of stone and dust pressing down on the sleeping god. Then came the centuries of silence. The library burned, the harbor choked with wreckage, and the world forgot where the first conqueror lay. When travelers asked, the locals pointed in different directions. Some said the tomb had been moved to protect it. Others swore that Ptolemy's descendants had hidden it deep beneath the city, sealing the doors with curses and salt. No one agreed, and no one returned from searching. As centuries turned to millennia, the ground itself began to change. The coastline retreated. The waves crept inland, and earthquakes cracked the marble foundations. One night, the sea took a breath and pulled part of the city beneath the water. Temples, columns, and statues fell together into the dark. Somewhere among them, the tomb slipped quietly into the abyss, its golden coffin sinking without sound. No historian recorded the exact year. The empire of memory had crumbled. Alexandria rose again and again upon the bones of itself, never realizing what slept beneath. Divers who explored the ruins centuries later found fragments of stone carved with stars, pieces of glass that shimmered in the dark. None could say for certain what they had touched. Some believed the tomb still existed, hidden beneath the silt of the harbor, untouched by air, guarded by the same silence that once ruled 1,000 cities. Others said the sea had claimed him at last, that the god who would not rot had dissolved into the salt that feeds the waves. And so the world moved on, the streets filled with new languages, the temples with new gods. But sometimes, when storms rise over the Mediterranean, sailors speak of a faint light moving beneath the surface, gold and steady, drifting through the black water. They call it the Lantern of Alexander, and in that glow, the empire of a vanished god still breathes. The centuries erased his name from the tongues of men, but not from the pulse of the earth. The empire he had built out of blood and dust dissolved into kingdoms that forgot him, yet every ruin carried his shadow. The road from Babylon to Alexandria became a memory of stone, and the wind that once carried the cries of his armies now moved through broken pillars and empty courtyards. The world no longer feared him, but it could not forget him either. In time, the story of his death grew louder than the story of his life. The man who had dreamed of immortality had found it, not in glory, but in decay turned to legend. His body had vanished, but his absence became a temple. Poets called him the sun that drowned itself. Historians called him the storm that never settled. Philosophers saw in his fate the cruel perfection of ambition, the proof that even the greatest fire leaves only ash. Across the ages, rulers tried to repeat his conquest. They took his symbols, his tactics, his name. None could escape the same silence. For what Alexander truly conquered was not land or people, but the imagination of humanity. And that victory was both eternal and cursed. The more men worshipped him, the more they resembled his corpse shining on the surface, hollow within. When the oceans swallowed his tomb, the last trace of his divinity returned to the elements. The salt became his breath, the tide his heartbeat. The same water that once mirrored his ships now carried his ghost beneath the waves. Every empire that rose after him followed the same path, born in conquest, dying in silence. History repeated his echo like a confession, each century whispering that power cannot be kept, only borrowed. If one listens at the shore of Alexandria during a quiet dawn, the sea still murmurs in broken syllables. It does not speak his name, only the lesson it left behind. That all kings become dust, that all gods return to silence, and that glory is the most fragile illusion of all. The true immortality is not in the flesh or in the crown, but in the fear and fascination that survive long after both are gone. And so, the empire of Alexander endures, not in cities or armies, but in the trembling of every man who dreams of ruling the world. His story remains a warning written in the bones of time, a reminder that those who defy mortality are the first to be devoured by it. The golden light that once followed him has faded, but its reflection still burns in the dark corners of history. If you believe that history still bleeds, that silence still remembers, and that no empire truly dies, subscribe to our channel and descend with us into the shadows where legends are never allowed to rest.